All right, this is FTD number 10. Lesson 10 is a period that's in the full flight simulator normally. So you graduate to the point where you can go to the full flight simulator. Up until this point, anywhere along the line, if a student needed additional training, it could have been on the early periods like 3 and 4 where they're having problems, or it could be on the later periods like 7, 8, and 9. But regardless, when you get to lesson 10, your progress is good. You may have had retraining, or you've gone all the way through smoothly. And then lesson 10, you wouldn't get to lesson 10 if you're having problems, because it is the transition from the flat panel trainer, or the FTD, to the full flight simulator. And once you get in the full flight simulator, even though it's a FTD period, it's got no motion, no visual. Well, we turn on the visual usually, even though we're not supposed to. So at that point, the student gets to see the everything in 3 dimensions. So things like lighting, you can't really do in the flat panel trainer. You can do it on Aerowings. It kind of works there, but you don't have a chance to have a control column, rudder pedals, a real seat that you can put up and down and back and forth. And, all the things that you touched with your finger, instead of actually manipulating a control, you get now to manipulate a control. So that FTD 10 is normally broken up into 2 periods, 2 hours for the first student, 2 hours for the second period. It's the same lesson basically with a few modifications. And then at that point, once they get done with that lesson, then it's time to go on to the full flight simulator after they complete FTD 10. So with that, let's look at the lesson overview for Ftd-Pc Fs number 10. It's a flight from Boeing Field to Moses Lake. We'll be a freighter, and we'll be in pounds, and we'll be back to the legacy FMC. The overview is we're going to have a cargo fire overheat. I'm not sure that's correct. A pneumatic non-normal, FMS navigation exercises, an engine fire leading to a shutdown, an ILS approach at Moses Lake, which leads to a missed approach, and then there's an amendment to the missed approach that we have to program in. And then there's a diversion to Spokane because the weather in Moses Lake is such that we cannot get back in. And then on the way to Moses Lake, we have a single FMC failure. Usually that's on one period, and then a dual FMC failure in the other period. But since we're only doing one period, it's going to be a single FMC failure, and we'll go through that procedure. And then that'll be followed by a second FMC failure, so we have both FMCs out. And then as we get into the Spokane area, we'll do a ILS approach to an auto land, and then shut down and secure. Here's the objectives for lesson 10. Again, flight from Boeing Field to Moses Lake, fire cargo forward, it looks like. I think that's good. Cruise climb. Oh yeah, it looks like we have an overheat engine to nacelle non-normal. Yeah, I guess that'll be good. Pack 1 non-normal I may change because I know we've done that. Fire engine 2, we'll probably make fire engine 3 since we did an engine 2 failure last time. We'll go to the engine out cruise page. We go into Moses Lake, do the ILS approach to a missed approach with an inboard engine out. And then we proceed to the modified holding pattern that was given to us. There'll be a diversion to Spokane, and then on the way to Spokane, there'll be a left FMC failure, then a right FMC failure, and then the ILS into Spokane, shut down and secure. They don't mention the route modification, but I think there's a route modification in here as well. Here's our flight plan for lesson 10. We're out of Boeing Field at Bravo 4, runway 14 right. I'll probably do a full cockpit setup, but I'll do it, silently, and I'll do it quickly. But since it is lesson 10, we'll take it from the point where we have to do an electrical power up, and then all the way through to engine start and taxi out to runway 14 right for departure. Route of flight will be Seattle, Victor 23 McKean, direct Beezer, Victor 2 Ellensburg, Victor 336 Ephrata, direct Moses Lake. The SID will be, well, it wouldn't be the Needle 9 because that's off runway 32 left. So that's probably wrong there. That's going to be the Kent 8. So Kent 8 or Kent 1, whatever it is, whatever the current one is. So it's probably going to be the Kent departure, not the Needle departure, because that's off the opposite runway. Destination Moses Lake, alternate Spokane will be Sonic 44 Heavy. In pounds will be 480,000 pounds, zero fuel weight. 150,000 pounds fuel on board, gross weight 630,000 pounds. 20,000 reserve, cost index 100, cruise altitude will be 190. We use TO2 with climb 2 armed. Be a flap 10 takeoff, and we'll use, we're back to NADP 2, which is 1,000 feet acceleration height. Flap 5 thrust reduction, and the engine out acceleration height is 1,000 feet via our company procedures, we'll say. Wind is calm, slope is 0, CG will be 25, ATIS information, Juliet will be current. The winds are calm, 1 statute mile, light snow, overcast skies at 1,000 feet, temperature 0, dew point -2, altimeter 2975. We'll be departing 14 right, ILS 14 right's in use. And so you can see we have icing conditions with precipitation and temperature less than 10 Celsius. We're also less than 3 Celsius, so that's where we would require the engine run-ups as we taxi out if we were more than 30 minutes. And then, of course, we'll have the static run-up that we've done a couple of times now prior to takeoff, which is for the GE engines is that 60% N1 for 30 seconds and then take off. Clearance will be, when we pick it up, we'll be cleared to Moses Lake via runway 14 right. There's the Kent departure down in the clearance. It'll be the Kent, whatever's current, Kent 9 or 1 or whatever it is. Departure direct McKean. Flight plan route, climb maintain 6,000, expect flight level 190, 10 minutes after departure. Seattle departure 126.5, and we'll squawk 7236. Here's the lesson events. LNAV, VNAV departure. We will get a speed restriction. We've done that a couple times. But we'll get a speed restriction to maintain a certain speed to a certain altitude. There's the route modification. There is a route modification on this lesson. And, typically you always get one on a check ride in flight. We'll do the fire cargo forward. We'll have a cruise climb from flight level 190, I think, up to flight level 250. We'll have an overheat engine 2 nacelle. And then pack 1. Yeah, I'll look for something else to do there because I'm pretty sure we did that. And we selected A and then tried to reset it, and then we went to B and tried to reset it. And I think we turned the pack off, so I think we've done that non-normal. On the way into Moses Lake, we'll do the ILS 32 right. Moses Lake transition will be given to us, but then that's as we get closer to Moses Lake, maybe the radar is out of service, but then the radar becomes back in service, and so we get radar vectors for the approach. And then we'll modify that ILS. Instead of having a transition, of course, we'll extend the line into probably Peli in preparation for radar vectors instead of the transition. We'll have a fire engine 3 that'll be secured. We'll go to the engine out cruise page and make that active. We descend into Moses Lake. We do the approach. We get some amended approach instructions. And instead of BATM, which is the published missed approach hold, we'll get a hold out to Ephrata. And we'll program that in addition to what they want us to do at that holding pattern. And then we'll do the approach to a missed approach. We'll go to Ephrata hold. The weather will be such that we can't get back into Moses Lake, so we'll set up for diversion to Spokane. We'll climb to a new cruise altitude given to us by ATC, and then we'll get our clearance to Spokane. We'll make the arrival preparations for the ILS into Spokane, and then on the way in we'll get a left FMC failure, go through that procedure, and then that'll be followed shortly thereafter by a right FMC failure. The map looks like this. So the purple line would be the original flight plan that we would be flying, and the yellow line would be the modification to that flight plan. So initially we'll be going out to on the Kent departure out to Zigged, and then somewhere we'll get direct McKean. But then on the way to McKean we'll get an amended routing, and you can see here that instead of going via the purple route, we're going to be going via the yellow route, which will involve a couple of airways. When we get into the Moses Lake area, we will not do the transition that they gave us, but instead we'll be on a heading for radar vectors for the approach. That's the orange line there. And then the approach, we'll do a missed approach out to Ephrata. Instead of, this shows, let's see, yeah, this is not right. Because this should be out to Ephrata here, where the holding pattern is. So we should have a holdout here. Then we're going to get a clearance to Spokane, and then on the way into Spokane, we'll get radar vectors for the approach as well. And there's Spokane. Okay, let's go to the PowerPoint. Many of the things we've done, so we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about them. Take a look. We are going to get a speed restriction again, so the speed restriction will be to maintain speed 280 to 15,000, and we've done that before. There's two methods to do it. Remember, the heads down method or heads up method. Heads down method is doing it in the CDU on the climb page, and generally, if you're below 10,000 feet, the pilot monitoring would do that. If you're above 10,000 feet, the pilot flying could do it because he's on the climb page normally. But anything under 10,000 feet, the pilot flying is not going to be manipulating the CDU. So if you wanted it done on the climb page, you'd have to instruct the pilot monitoring to go to the climb page and put that restriction in on the climb page. So either way, that's a heads down method. And once we put that speed restriction in of 280 at 15,000 on the speed restriction line, then once we pass 10,000 feet, the speed transition will go away. The speed will accelerate, but it's going to stop at 280. And then, of course, till 15,000. Once it gets to 15,000, this will disappear. The speed restriction will go back to dashes, and then we'll go to our econ climb speed. The heads-up method would be, again, more if you're below 10,000 feet and you really don't want to manipulate the CDU, and maybe you don't want to even tell the pilot monitoring to put it on the climb page, well, then it would be via the mode control panel. So that would be the speed intervention. And in that case, you could open the window by pushing the selector. The heads-up method is more of a... Again, you use it below 10,000 feet, and it's the easier one to do because you don't have to type anything out. So all you have to do is reach up, push the speed intervention, or the speed selector. That opens the window. That's speed intervention. And again, remember the title of the VNAV page changes to active MCP speed climb. And then you can dial that back to a 280. And of course, the speed restriction line would be in dashes whenever we got that clearance. We'll end up somewhere along the line, probably prior to Orton, getting a route modification. The route modification will be after McKean to proceed to Victor 2040 Yakima and Victor 448 to Moses Lake. And so you can see they've already put that in. They've gone to the route page. And after McKean, they put in Victor 204. You got boxes. They put in Yakima. And then Victor 448, they typed that out. Then you got boxes and then to Moses Lake. And so instead of going Orton, McKean, Beezer, and on that way, we're going to go to McKean and then to out here to White and Tampo and Yakima, all part of that airway, or two airways, Victor 204 and Victor 448. So you can see they've already put it in. It's ready for execution. Once you execute it, then the old route will disappear and the new route goes to magenta. Modified route 1 becomes active route 1. The erase prompt goes away. The execute light extinguishes and the route modification is complete. There's no unwanted segment in this case. You can see that it's pretty clean the way we've done it. There's nothing here. It's all gone. So there's nothing to delete as far as an unwanted segment goes. I will then have a forward cargo fire, and we'll go to fire cargo forward. That's going to be in the Fs. And we've got fire cargo forward, and that's for the passenger. We're going to be a freighter. So we'll get the master warning and the bell and the forward light on the cargo compartment overhead panel. And the condition will be that smoke is detected in the lower forward cargo compartment. And then fire cargo arm switch confirm armed. So that's going to be a confirmation. Again, as the pilot monitoring, I'd probably read this whole thing first. Fire cargo, fire arm switch, confirm armed. SATCOM will shut down to prevent overheating. System shuts down 2 packs and respective pack ICAS messages are shown. And then I go up to the switch and say forward cargo, fire arm switch, confirm. And the pilot flying will look at it and say confirm. And then I'll push it and say armed. And of course, that's going to do a bunch of things. You know, it's going to turn those 2 packs off, and there's a list of things that it does. Pack control selectors, affected packs, and that's going to be number 2 and 3 on the freighter. Off, set to a maximum of 1 pack on. So we'll bring packs 2 and 3 off. And then cargo fire depress discharge switch, push and hold for 1 second. So we'll lift the guard and push and hold for 1 second. And then in the freighter 570, 210 minutes of fire suppression are available. And then of course when you discharge in the freighter, you know, you're going to get A and B. There's 4 bottles, and A and B are going to fire immediately. And then C and D will fire after a brief delay. And that brief delay is about 30 minutes. And then choose one if the airplane is at or below 8,000 feet, or the airplane is above 8,000 feet. We go to step 5. In this case, if we're above 8,000 feet, step 5 will have you bring the landing altitude switch to a manual. And then landing altitude selector, set the landing altitude between 8,000 and 8,500 to command the cabin altitude to 8,000 feet. And that's going to help with smoke removal. And then plan to land at the nearest suitable airport. Do not accomplish following checklist, landing altitude. And then checklist complete except deferred items. We'll have that problem, but we're going to continue to Moses Lake. We're not going to divert. We'll do the cruise climb. Again, we've done that multiple times. Once you get to 19,000 feet, flight level 190, we'll get a cruise climb up to flight level 250. So we'll set 250 in the window, push the altitude selector, and that's automatically going to change the cruise altitude on the VNAV climb page to 250, and it will automatically, the title of the page will go to Active Econ Cruise Climb, and the airplane will then climb at cruise speed up to your new cruise altitude of 250. So we can do all of that on the mode control panel. I'll think of something to do here other than the Pack 1 problem. Again, the main thing is to have some non-normals to show that the crew can manage the airplane properly. decide who's going to fly the airplane, who's going to do the checklist, and then for the person that's doing the checklist, the pilot monitoring, to be able to get it out, to read it and do it properly. So all that's kind of evaluated on lesson 10 as well, to make sure that anything that needs to be cleaned up can be cleaned up prior to the full flight. But these couple of non-normals are there primarily for to check that they can run a non-normal procedure efficiently and correctly. Then we'll go with the ILS approach preparations into Moses Lake. And so we'll select the depart key. In this case, the logic hasn't switched over yet. Remember, the logic is that you have to be more than 400 miles or half the distance, whichever comes first. And if you're still within that 400 miles or half the distance, then it would reselect the Boeing field arrival page, because it figures you want to go back to Boeing field. But if you happen to be more than 400 miles or more than half the distance to your destination, whichever comes first, it would then select the Moses Lake arrival page. So if you don't get what you want, in this case we did not get what we wanted, we push depart, we see Boeing field arrivals, well, we always had the index prompt down here to get to the depart index. And then when you get to the index, of course, for Route 1 here, which is active, you can select the Moses Lake arrivals, and then that would give you the Moses Lake arrival page. And from there, we can select the ILS 32 right. Yeah, it looks like we will get the Moses Lake transition, so we'll select that. Again, this is what they would have told us to expect. And then we'll go ahead and execute that. We'll have a fire engine 3. I think last time we did an engine failure, but I believe we have done a fire before. Let's go back to the QRH and look at it. So on the quick action index, you notice that we have fire engine 1, 2, 3, 4, and that's going to be 8.2. But of course, the first thing we're going to do in any event is always do the memory items first, and then we'll go to the checklist second. And so again, the anything above the dashed black line are memory items. Anything below the black dashed line are checklist items to be completed, to be read and completed. So the memory items we know are thrust lever to confirm to idle, fuel control switch to confirm to cutoff, and engine fire switch to confirm pull. And then if the engine fire message is still shown, to rotate to the stop and hold for 1 second, and then to time for 30 seconds. And then after 30 seconds, if the light's still illuminated, then we're going to go ahead and rotate to the other stop and hold for 1 second. And that'll complete the memory items. So again, the pilot flying will always initiate the, if we have a fire engine, we'd identify it. In this case, it's going to be fire engine 3. And then the pilot flying would say fire engine 3 memory items, or recall items, you could say either one. And then he's going to start it, so he's going to be the one to kind of initiate that and say thrust lever number 3, confirm. And he's going to put his hand on it. And the pilot monitoring will confirm it and say confirm. And then the pilot flying will bring the thrust lever to idle. And then once he gets it back to idle, he'll say continue, and that lets the pilot monitoring know that he can continue with the memory items. And the pilot monitoring would put his hand on the fuel control switch number 3 and say fuel control switch number 3, confirm. And then the pilot flying will look at it and say confirm. And the pilot monitoring will say cutoff and then go to cutoff on that number 3 fuel control switch. Then he'll reach up and he'll say engine fire switch number 3, confirm. And the pilot flying will look up and he'll say confirm that he's got the correct fire switch. And there's a little bit of a technique here, because sometimes when you're sitting, if the captain is the pilot flying and the pilot monitoring is the one reaching up to the fire switch, a lot of times you want to, when you reach up with your left hand, you want to kind of cup the fire switch to the left. And then really the pilot flying can't see it then, because he's sitting in the left seat and he looks up and your hand's right in the way. So a lot of times you kind of have to get used to reaching up, but on the right side of the fire switch, and at least letting them see it first. and then say, engine fire switch number 3, confirm. He says confirm, and then you can switch your hand around the other side to pull it. You don't want to be covering the switch when he's trying to look at it, because he's just going to glance up there for a second and take a look at it, because he's busy flying the airplane, making sure the rudder's set, and probably trimming out the airplane. And so he's got to confirm it, but he's not going to sit there and stare at it. So when he looks up at your hand, if it's in the way, that kind of provides an inconvenience for him to see the fire light on that switch. So something you have to kind of be aware of when you're sitting in the right seat, and or if you're sitting in the left seat, and same thing, you could cup the fire switch the wrong way, and the first officer wouldn't be able to see it if you're the pilot flying, and you kept him as the pilot flying. Then he's going to want to be able to see that. So once we complete that, engine fire switch number 3, confirm, and if the light is still illuminated, pull the fire switch out. Of course, remember, it's going to freely come out because you brought the fuel control switch to cutoff. That's going to unlock the fuel control switch, but just having the fire unlocks the fuel control switch. So really, even if you didn't go to cutoff on the fuel control switch, that fire switch will still come out because it was unlocked by the fire. Anytime there's a fire, that'll unlock the fire switch, so you can pull it freely without having to override and pull it. So we'll pull that, and then you wait a second or two just to see if the light extinguishes. If it does not extinguish, then you're going to rotate to the stop and hold for 1 second. Doesn't matter which way you rotate it. And again, you have to rotate it all the way to the stop, which is that last little oomph. There's a little bit of a sponginess to it, so when you bring the fire switch when you rotate it, you have to kind of go that last little oomph, and you'll feel there's just a little give there where that's what actually fires the squib. So if you just pull it, rotate it, and you don't hold it all the way to the stop, you could rotate it without firing the bottle. And of course, we're going to verify that the bottle's been discharged by the ICAST message. And then we'll hack our clock, start the time for 30 seconds. Then after 30 seconds, if the light's still illuminated, we're going to rotate to the other stop and hold for 1 second. And those would be the recall items or memory items. And then continue to the next page, fire engine 3 in this case. If high vibration occurs and continues after engine shutdown, without delay, reduce airspeed and descend to a safe altitude, which results in an acceptable vibration level. If high vibration returns and further airspeed reduction and descent are not practical, increasing airspeed may reduce the vibration. And then for the freighter, go to step 7. That would be transponder mode selector TA only. And for severe engine damage, separation, or an engine fire that does not extinguish, plan to land at the nearest suitable airport. In our case, in the FTD, it is going to extinguish. Typically in the full flight, you're going to get problems that do not extinguish, especially when like a second engine fails. And then that'll result in a returning for immediate landing. Do not accomplish the following checklist: engine shutdown, and that completes the fire engine 3 checklist. And of course, once the engine is shut down due to fire or severe damage or separation, there's no restarting it, obviously, so it's shut down completely. We'll go to the engine out VNAV page. We've talked about that, and we'll execute that. There'll be no drift down again because we're below our max altitude, and we don't need engine out speed because the terrain's not going to be a factor where we are. And so we'll stay at flight level 250, and we'll get the long-range cruise speed for one engine and operative once we execute that. Then we'll descend and maintain 4,000 feet from the top of descent, expecting that ILS 32 right with the Moses Lake transition. But we will get a modification to the missed approach hold, and the modification will be to hold, in the event of a missed approach, to go direct to Ephrata, to hold southwest of Ephrata on the 240 radial with left turns. So the missed approach hold will be Batum, so we're going to need to change to Ephrata. And the way we can do that is we can go to the legs page, and after runway 32 right, we can type out Echo Papa Hotel and put it at the L3 position. And that will create a discontinuity because this is what's after that is the missed approach hold to Batum. And then we can go to page 2, or in this case page 3 it looks like. And we can delete Batum. And then when you delete Batum, that's going to also take out the hold at Batum. So by deleting Batum, we'll have to execute that, and then once we execute that, you'd be left with Peli, runway 32 right, and Ephrata. Now we have to have a waypoint in here in order to hold at a waypoint. So for example, a common mistake sometimes is that you could, since we're given the missed approach hold amendment to go direct to Ephrata, sometimes what people do is they'll come down here and press the hold key. And then what will happen is they'll get the legs page with hold at boxes, and they'll put in Echo Papa Hotel, and they'll put Ephrata into the boxes, the hold boxes. And what happens is in the scratch pad it says hold at EPH. That's all it says. And what it's trying to tell you, but it doesn't do it in a good way, is it's trying to tell you that you're trying to hold at a place that is not part of your route. You haven't put it in yet. It's not a waypoint on your legs page. It's not part of your routing. So as a result, it really can't hold there. And so I always thought it would be better because that's not intuitive to a pilot. I always thought it would have been better to put a question mark after it. Hold it, Ephrata? I can't. So if you try to hold at a point that's not part of your route, it's not going to go to the hold page. It's going to just have a scratch pad message saying hold it, Ephrata. So if we did not put this Ephrata in here, you would get that. If you tried to hold without Ephrata being part of your route, that's what you're going to get. But once you have Ephrata in there like we do here, and we've executed it, we got rid of Batum, okay, now we can hold it Ephrata because it's part of our routing. And we could push the hold key. And when you do, you get the legs page with hold at boxes. But again, let's pretend Ephrata was not here at all, and you did this and put it in the boxes. Well, you're not going to get the hold page. It's just going to say hold at EPH. And that's not very intuitive to a pilot, what that means. But it means you're trying to hold at a point that's really not part of your legs page yet, or you haven't made it part of your legs page, so you can't hold there because it's not part of your route. So in this case, we'll bring Ephrata to the scratch pad, put it in the boxes. And then, of course, we can, the clearance is going to be to hold southwest on the 240 radial left turns. Well, they've already done that. So what they've done is they've put 240 in the scratch pad, and they've line selected that to L2. And because you can specify a holding pattern like we talked about as a radial or as an inbound course, either one. Well, if it's given to you as a radial at a VOR, what's easiest to put it in as a radial. So he gave us the clearance, hold southwest on the 240 radial left turns. So the easiest thing to do here is just to type out 240, put it in the radial line, and then let the computer figure out the quadrant and let the computer figure out the inbound course. It does all that for you. So even if you put in W/240 and you line selected it up here, it would change it to southwest because all it looks at is the number. It doesn't care about the quadrant. It gets the quadrant from the number. So if you put in the wrong, you could put south/240 and it'll change it to southwest. Or you could put north/240 and it would change it to southwest. It's just looking at the number. And then, of course, it's always going to give you the reciprocal. And then the default is always going to be right turns. So we have to change it to left turns. And so we did that already by just typing L in the scratch pad, line selecting it to the L3 position. And then that changed it from right to left turns. And so they've already done that. Anytime you're given a VOR hold with a radial, it's easiest just to put it in the radial line, because then the computer does the work of figuring out the quadrant and the reciprocal. and the inbound and the turns will always be right, and you need to change it to left. And then, of course, the leg time is always going to be a minute or a minute and a half, depending on where you are. So if you're above 14,000 feet, it'll be a minute and a half. If you're below 14,000 feet, it'll be a minute. And it always defaults to the leg time. And then, of course, the leg distance you can put in. If you were given 10-mile legs, you could put in 10-mile legs, and then that would get rid of the leg time. But if nothing is said about leg distance, then we'll just default to the inbound leg time, which is normally a minute or a minute and a half. So we'll change this to reflect what ATC wants us to do for the amendment to the missed approach. We'll execute that. And then you can see on the legs page we have Peli, runway, and then off of the runway direct to Ftd, and then the hold at Ftd at 4,000 feet. We put the 4,000 feet in there, and then that's complete with what ATC wants us to do. We'll do the missed approach as well. Actually, we'll past Rubel, we'll get vectors for the ILS approach. And instead of, again, we have all this stuff in here: Moses Lake, Peli, course reversal, back to Peli, to the runway, to the missed approach. So we had that whole transition in there. But once he gives us the fact that radar is back in service, then we can go ahead and then get radar vectors. And once we're on vectors, we can extend a line into Peli. So we're going to do that, and that will change it from a approach with a transition to a radar vector approach, because the radar is back in service. Usually the only way you're doing a transition of it is if radar's out. That's typically what you're going to do, because if radar's in service, they're going to want to sequence you and vector you and slow down, speed up, do this, do that, turn left, turn right. But if the radar's out of service, then they have no choice but to give something like a approach with an approach transition. And so in this case, we'll go ahead and extend the line to Peli. And then we'll go ahead and vectors in for the ILS approach. So now you can see we've got Peli with an extension, the 324 extension into Peli. And then the runway, 324 final approach course into runway 32 right. Then in the event of a miss to Ftd and the hold to Ftd. You can see by doing that, we're a little bit high in the path. But at this point, once, let's say we were on the transition and we were right on the path, but now we go ahead and do this, and now we have drag required and we're above the path. Well, at this point, we're going to transition to flight level change. We're not going to stay in VNAV, because VNAV would have a tendency to not give us real accurate information as soon as we get, be vectored and get far enough out here. It could affect our rate of descent in an unfavorable way. So once we're given something like this, we're going to go to flight level change, and if we need to, expedite, depending on where we are in relation to Peli and our altitude. Then we're going to do the approach and do the missed approach out to Ftd, which is the amended hold. And we'll go to Ftd and hold. Again, on the missed approach, we push toga, go around thrust, flaps 20, positive rate, gear up. 400 feet, we select a roll mode, heading select or LNAV. If ATC says nothing, it's LNAV. If they give us a heading, it'll be heading select. In many cases, they'll give you a heading on a missed approach, but if nothing is said, then we're expected to carry out the published missed approach. And then at 1,000 feet, your choice, you could go VNAV. Window will blank, speed will go up to your flap limit speed minus 5 knots. And then we would retract flaps on schedule all the way to the up, or you could limit the speed by speed intervening, bring the speed back, and then stop the flaps at whatever you want, like 5 if you're going to go hold. So in our case today, we'll probably limit the flaps since we're going to the holding pattern, and we could use flight level change or VNAV. I think last time we used flight level change, so maybe this time we'll use VNAV. And speed intervene and keep the speed at whatever speed we need to keep the flaps at 5. And then we'll enter the hold at 200 knots or less, and we'd be complying with the max holding speed. If we want to hold faster, clean up, we can, but then we have to advise ATC that we need a higher speed in the hold, and they'll approve it. Once we're in the hold, we're going to get the word that the company wants us to go to Spokane. Weather at Moses Lake is not good, or ATC tells us the weather's not good, and we have to make a decision. So we make a decision to go to Spokane, where the weather is much better. And again, with the Legacy, we talked about last week how you can use the alternate page in order to go to Spokane. And that would be for the FMCNG. But with the Legacy, and we're going to be on the Legacy this time, we just have to go to the route page and change the destination to a KGEG and execute it. And then that will change the logic for the depart page and also give you the proper pressurization schedule into Spokane, since we're proposing to go there now instead of Moses Lake. We'll get the clearance to that after one turn and hold, proceed direct to Spokane VOR and hold. And in order to do that, we're going to have to exit the hold. Now, if he said after one turn and holding, he means one complete turn and holding. So in order to exit the hold, you'd want to go ahead and you can exit armed and you get the execute light, but you don't want to execute this till you're more than 2/3 of the way out on the outbound leg. If you did it earlier than that, it would shorten up the holding pattern. If you wait till you're 2/3 or more outbound visually, you can just eyeball it. If you're more than 2/3, or you could wait till it starts turning inbound on the outbound leg, then it's not going to change the holding pattern length at all. But anything less than about 2/3, it's going to shorten up the holding pattern. And if he said after one turn and hold, proceed direct to GEG, climb and maintain 1000, let's say, for the amended routing, then you want to wait for till that 2/3 or more of the way out before you execute it. And then, of course, depending on what we're given, routing we could change. In this case, it's just going to be after you're freight of direct Spokane, VOR, which is GEG. And our amended altitude to climb to for the going to Spokane is going to be 1000. So we'll go to the climb page and we'll put in 1000 in the boxes. We're still kind of in cruise at this point, but we can go ahead and reactivate the climb page by putting 1000 in and executing it. And then we'll set 1000 when we're given the clearance to do that, and we'll climb in VNAV to 1000. After you freight it, it'll hit you freight it and then go direct to GEG. And then we'll be given the weather and approach in use at Spokane. It'll be the ILS runway 3 approach into Spokane, so we'll put that in. We'll be expecting radar vectors for that. And then on the way to Spokane, we will get a single FMC failure and then a dual FMC failure. So most of the stuff up to this point has been stuff that has been done before. So it's, it should go pretty smooth for the students. Again, they're getting a chance to be in the simulator and do this stuff in the simulator. So they're starting to feel comfortable with the actual physical stuff that they have in the simulator. And but when we get to this part, it's probably new stuff at this point. So this would be a single FMC failure and then a dual FMC failure. So with a dual FMC failure, there is a scenario of an actual event that occurred. I don't know who it was or when it happened. It was a 747-400, I know that. And the resulting pilot actions that happened as a result of the dual FMC failure. The flight deck indications that you have with the dual FMC failure. The difference between the FMC source select, the instrument source select switch versus the FMC master selector. The available CDU pages that you have when you lose both FMCs. And then, of course, because you lose both FMCs, you're going to lose that ability to calculate, for the computer to calculate your VRF speed. So you're going to have to, based on your VRF speed, you're going to have to calculate your flap limit speeds or your flap maneuvering speeds and then come up with a little graph or a listing of what your flaps up speed will be, flaps 1, flaps 5, flaps 10, flaps 20, and flap 30 speeds will be, because that's not going to be available in the computer anymore when you lose both the big computers. And then the training points, and this is just more of reference to the full flight, where it used to be the, I think it was the rapid descent, I can't remember, maybe it was the engine fire, something was moved from lesson 10 to lesson 6, and the FMC fail was moved from lesson 6 to lesson 10. And they have a reason for that. You'll see that here, but not a big deal for us. So this flight departed from the Middle East. I think they were over the water between Cyprus, Turkey, Syria, Lebanon, and Israel, talking to 3 different controllers simultaneously. And they had a dual FMC failure. And one of the first things you get is you get an autopilot degraded message. And it's a caution message. So you hear beep, 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 and you'll see autopilot in amber. And what they did is they manually disconnected the autopilot, thinking there was an autopilot problem. And of course, immediately when they did that, they probably started discussing something, and who knows, but they got off course. And so that can be a problem when you're in an area like they were in. This kind of shows where they were. I think they were over the water somewhere in this area, maybe. Yeah, somewhere in here. So here's what they got. They got the master caution. They got the autopilot degraded message. They got a caret indicating that there's no procedural steps for that. You can go to the checklist and it'll tell you what it is, and it'll say the autopilot's operating in a degraded mode, but there's no step 1, step 2, step 3. There's nothing that really tells you what to do here. But one thing you have to realize when you get the autopilot degraded message is it's operating in a degraded mode, which means it goes into what's called an attitude stabilizing mode. And it basically just maintains your heading and maintains your attitude, whatever you're in at the time of the degradation. Now that differs very much so from an autopilot disconnect. Of course, this is what they got when they disconnected the autopilot. They got the master warning, they got the siren, they got the autopilot disconnect message, they got all that stuff when they disconnected. But when you get an autopilot message, it doesn't, a caution message, it doesn't necessarily mean you have to disconnect the autopilot. The first place you should look when you have one of these is you need to look at your FMAs, because the autopilot degraded message again means the selected autopilot's operating in a degraded mode. Now it could mean the engaged roll and or pitch mode may have failed. So where do you look to determine the AFDS status, the autopilot flight director's status? You look at the FMA. So when you get a message like this, the first place you look is your flight mode enunciations, because that could be the problem. Not necessarily, but it could be the problem. So this is what you had before both FMCs failed. You have speed, LNAV, VNAV, path. You're at your cruise altitude, you're in command. And then when the failure occurs, you're going to get something like this, where you have LNAV, and you have an amber line through LNAV, and you have VNAV, and you have an amber line through VNAV. Now, depending on whether you're in a climb, if let's say we're in VNAV speed here instead of VNAV path, you would probably get an amber line in VNAV, and VNAV speed would change to just VNAV, and you'd have an amber line, and this would be up here. But if you happen to be at your cruise altitude like we are now in VNAV path, what would happen is it would probably just come out of VNAV path and it would capture the altitude, your cruise altitude, because you're at, let's say, flight level 250, and it'll just capture that altitude and go to alt. So you could have an amber line through LNAV, amber line through VNAV if you're climbing. If you're not climbing, you probably have an amber line through LNAV and altitude hold message because it came out of VNAV path and it went to alt. You'll also notice that the auto throttle disengaged as well. So now that you have this degraded message, the first thing you do is look here and say, oh, I got a degraded roll mode and I have a degraded pitch mode. And let's say we have both. So the question is this okay? No, it's not okay. You have a degradation of a roll mode, degradation of a pitch mode. So the question is, well, what can you do in this case? Well, you can do something very quickly in order to get the autopilot back so it's not degraded anymore. You can go to another roll mode, you can go to another pitch mode. So in the case of LNAV, if your heading bug is right in front of you, you probably just go to heading select. You could go to heading hold also, any roll mode other than LNAV. So we'd probably go to heading select. And when you go to heading select, this amber line through LNAV would disappear and you get heading select here. And then if you had an amber line through VNAV, you could go to another pitch mode. If you were climbing, we'd go to flight level change. If you were in level flight, we'd go to alt, or it's going to go to alt automatically. Chances are it's probably going to go to alt automatically, and you'll see alt there. And the only thing you really need to do is go to heading select. Once you do that, the autopilot's happy. The autopilot says, oh, I'm not degraded anymore. Because before this, when you see this LNAV, VNAV with amber lines through it, it's in a attitude stabilizing mode. So all it does is hold your attitude, whatever you were in. If you're climbing, it'll hold that attitude. If you're descending, it'll hold that attitude. If you're in level flight, it'll hold that attitude. And then it's just going to kind of maintain the heading that you had prior to the degradation. And it's not really locked on to anything. So it's just kind of in this attitude stabilizing mode. So what we have to do is we have to get it locked onto something. So what we do is just go to, if this is the case of the autopilot degradation, then all we need to do is select another roll mode and or select another pitch mode. And when you do that, everything is great as far as the autopilot's concerned. That autopilot message will go away. Of course, the auto throttle would still be disengaged because you have a dual FMC failure. So you'd have to manage your thrust manually at that point. Now, if you have a loss of a single FMC, now let's take that first. And let's say that the selector is on the left. This is the selector that's on the instrument panel, and it's in the forward instrument panel, and it's just to the left of the gear handle, and it's what's called the FMC master switch. And the master switch has two positions, left and right. Normally it's kept on the left. Now if the left FMC were to fail, we'd have a single FMC failure. And what you would get in that case is you would get the autopilot degraded message. You would get the auto throttle disconnect message. You're going to hear that pretty much promptly. You get the master caution in the case of both of these. So you heard beep, 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 beep. And then it's going to take a little bit of time, but eventually you'll get the FMC left message. Because what's going to happen is when you look at your flight instruments, after about 30 seconds of this failure, because the map retains kind of an image of the map for 30 seconds, but once the FMC is detected to be failed, you'll start to get a map flag, and the map will go away on your side. In this case, it'd be on the captain's side, because the captain has his instrument source selector switch on left FMC. So on the captain's side, he will eventually get a map flag, and his map will disappear. The magenta line and the triangle, the airplane symbol, and all that goes away. But the first thing you're going to see to kind of alert you that there's something wrong is you're going to get a vertical track error. The vertical deviation indicator is not working anymore, so that pretty much immediately comes on, the vertical track indication. And then after, a time period, the map will disappear and you'll get the map flag. And then, of course, maybe shortly after that, you're going to get the FMC left message. And so, again, we have an autopilot degraded message. So I'd look at my FMAs and I'd see that I have a line through LNAV and I have a line through VNAV, or it captured the altitude, one of the two. And the first thing I would want to do is take control of that. So I'd go, if my heading bug is in front of me, I'd want to make sure it's in front of me and not off to the side somewhere. I'm going to push heading select. As soon as I do that, the autopilot's happy. Or if I press flight level change, the autopilot's happy, depending on what failure you have. That autopilot message will then go away. The auto throttle disconnect message, well, I see that. I can get rid of that by clicking the auto throttle disconnect switch, and that will get rid of that message. And then I'll be left with FMC left, and I'd call for the FMC left checklist. And then when we go to the FMC left checklist, it's going to have us doing a couple of things. One of the things it's going to have us do is to take the FMC master selector and change it to the right, because there's nothing wrong with the right FMC. The reason this all failed is because the left FMC failed, and the left FMC is the master. And what that means is that the left FMC is sending information to the EECs, to the FCCs, and to the nav radios. So it's sending information to the electronic engine controls, to the flight control computers, and to the navigation radios. And so when you're in LNAV and VNAV and you have the autopilot engaged in command, the left FMC is the one that's giving information to the autopilot to fly the route in LNAV. So if LNAV fails, you're going to lose that ability. And so as a result, taking that FMC master selector and moving it to right will allow the right FMC to send information to the EECs, the FCCs, the flight control computers, and the nav radios. And then you're basically back in business, except that on your side, on the captain's side in this case, because it's the left, he's going to have to take his instrument source select switch and go from left FMC to right FMC. And then he'll get his map back. His map will come back, his vertical track flag will go away, and he'll be back in business. And then as far as we're concerned, the FMCs will also restore themselves, because they've kind of shut down when you had this problem as well. They've gone to what's called alternate navigation. They used to refer to this as standby navigation. Now they refer to it as alternate navigation. And so the FMCs, when the left FMC fails, the CDUs will degrade to the alternate navigation mode. They'll go to the 3 pages that you have available to you when you're in alternate navigation. But once you switch from left to right master FMC, then the CDUs will go back to their normal pages that you normally have. And so there'll be 2 steps with the checklist. The one is to take your instrument source select switch and go to right on the captain's side, because it's the left that's affected. And then to take the master selector and go to the right. And then you can re-engage LNAV and VNAV at that point. You're back in business. Everything's normal again, except that you only have one FMC. So everything else would be completely normal when you change the instrument source select switch on the captain's side to right FMC, and you change the master selector to right FMC. Now, if you lose both FMCs, however, you're not only going to get the autopilot degraded message, and you're going to get the auto throttle disconnect, but eventually you're going to get both FMC left and FMC right messages. And again, if we did see this, we would right away look at the FMAs, the flight mode enunciations, and we would see that we're in heading select, or we would see that we're in a degraded mode, and then we can go to heading select, assuming our heading bug's in front of us. And then if we have a degraded pitch mode, we can go to flight level change, or we go to alt if it's not in alt, but chances are it probably defaulted to alt, altitude hold. And now we get FMC left and FMC right, and we go to the checklist where both FMCs are inoperative. Now, what's the difference between these 2 selectors? Well, we've been talking about that. This is the FMC master selector, and this is the instrument source select switch that each pilot has, one for the captain, one for the first officers, on your instrument source select panel. So normally the FMC, normally the captain is in the FMC left position, the first officer is in the FMC right position. But you'll notice you have the ability to change from the FMC left to the FMC right position. And for a single FMC failure, in this case the left, we would go ahead and do that because we'll get our map back on our ND when we change from left to right. And then we could take our master selector and go to right, and then we'd be back in business as far as LNAV and VNAV is concerned. And we'll be down to a single FMC problem. So this is the master selector. This is the instrument source select switch for the FMC, which both pilots have one. FMC left, first officer, FMC right. The master selector for the FMC, it kind of does three things, and we talked about that as well. It gives information to the FCCs, the flight control computers. I think this shows up here in a minute. And because the autopilot, the left FMC is giving the information to the flight control computers, so when you're flying in LNAV and VNAV, that information is coming from the left FMC. And if the left FMC fails, well, that's when you're going to get this degradation of modes. And that's when you're going to get the autopilot degraded message. And that's when you're going to have to do something about this, which is take control by going to a different roll mode, different pitch mode. You also are going to, the left FMC will give information to the EECs. So if the left FMC fails, the auto throttle is going to be lost. And so that's the thrust management function part of the flight management computer. And the auto throttle is kind of in that thrust management function part of the FMC. So if you lose, in this case, like the left FMC, you're going to lose the auto throttle as well. And that's why this goes blank. And you'll hear the beep, 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 beep. And then, of course, we're manual thrust at that point. And then the other thing that the master selector does is it gives information to the nav radios for automatic radio tuning and position updating. So we're going to lose that function as well. And then we're going to have to manually tune things like the ILS or the VOR frequency if they're not tuned already. But you would lose the ability to automatically tune nav aids like we have in the normal function. So that's all this master switch does. It gives information to the EECs, the FCCs, the nav radios. And again, that left FMC is giving information so the airplane can, when it's flying in LNAV and VNAV, that information is coming from that left FMC. Now when you lose both FMCs, here's what you get. You get 3 CDU pages. So you have a legs page, you have the progress page, and you have the nav radio page. But they're called the active IRS legs page, it's called the IRS progress page, and it's called the alternate nav radio page. And this is what you get when you're in alternate navigation, meaning both FMCs have failed. All the other pages you lose. So, VNAV pages, fixed pages, the route page, all that stuff's gone. All you have is legs, progress, and navrad. So active IRS legs, IRS progress page, and the alternate navrad page, those 3 pages. This is what the IRS legs page looks like. It's basically the same as a normal legs page as far as waypoints goes. So it retains all the waypoints that existed in your route at the time of the failure. So depending on where you are when both FMCs fail, and you program in your route to your destination, that route's still going to be there. All of those waypoints are still going to be there. Because you can kind of think of this as both FMCs are big computers. They're the big black boxes, that are in the E&E compartment. Well, the CDU itself is a little microprocessor. It's a little computer. And it has the ability to retain up to 120 waypoints that existed in your route at the time of the failure. So whatever's in your route is going to remain. And it remembers, what the latitude and longitude is of those points too, and it even lists it right here. And you still have the mileage between the points. And you'll notice that the first waypoint is magnetic, but everything else is true, because you don't have the FMC tables anymore of what the magnetic variation is of all those other waypoints. So it can't really figure out the magnetic course of all the other waypoints. It can figure out the magnetic course of the active waypoint, but not of any of the downtrack waypoints. So everything else will be in true. The first waypoint's in magnetic. You'll notice that if you wanted to go direct, let's say, ATC gives us direct to Papa Sierra Kilo, you could do it the way you normally do it. You could bring Papa Sierra Kilo to the scratch pad, and you could bring it to the top, and then you could execute it, and it'll go direct to Papa Sierra Kilo. Because what it's really doing is it's going to this lat long. And that's what it normally does in normal operation, too. It's just that we can call it this, but it knows what the lat long is at that waypoint. But when we're in alternate navigation, it's going to that lat long that represents Papa Sierra Kilo. And we can call it Papa Sierra Kilo because it's remembered. But if they cleared us somewhere that was off our route, then we would have to type in the lat long, because the only thing the microprocessor remembers, the little CDU remembers, is what was in there prior to the failure. But after that, it doesn't remember anything. So if you were given direct to, let's say, LAX, you'd have to put the lat long in for LAX VOR in order to navigate to that. Also, when you put in Papa Sierra Kilo and you bring it to the top, let's say, you're going to get on your map, you're going to get the white dashed line going to Papa Sierra Kilo, and you'll execute that, and you got a solid magenta line. But that's going to show up on your ND, but not the other pilot's ND, because they're completely separate now. The left CDU is different from the right CDU, is different from the center CDU. They're not talking to one another anymore. They're completely separate. So if you do a route modification in one and you want it to match, you have to do it on the other side too. And then how are we going to go to Papa Sierra Kilo? Well, we don't have LNAV anymore, so we have to use heading select. So we could, set our heading bug to go to Papa Sierra Kilo. But there's no LNAV, there's no VNAV, there's no auto throttle. And we lose a lot of our pages, our nice pages that we had as a convenience. All that stuff's gone when you're dual FMC. And these are all the mileages to between the waypoints. Progress page looks very similar to the normal progress page, except instead of ETAs now you have time to go. So before we had ETAs that would say when we're going to get there is referencing our time. Well, now we have time to go, so we'd have to add our time to that time to go to get when we're going to be there. So if the next waypoint is Golf Victor Echo, then we'd have to add 25 minutes to our current time to get the time we're going to get there. We also have the distance to go. That's no different from the active waypoint to the next waypoint to the destination. But you'll notice down here there's some differences. The IRS that's associated with this CDU will be shown. In this case, it's the right IRS. So this would be like the first officer's CDU. And the right IRS would be associated there, and it would give the lat long of the right IRS. It would also give the ground speed that's coming from that IRU. And then it would give our cross-track error. If we do have the magenta line, we can see what our cross-track error is to that magenta line as we fly it in heading select. It's going to have the desired track and the actual track as well between the what's on the CDU as far as the magenta line goes. So the progress page is actually pretty similar, except it just doesn't have those nice ETAs. And it's got some additional information down here that you didn't have on the normal progress page. And then the alternate nav-rad page is going to be different in the sense that you're just going to see the VORs that are associated with your side, the ADF that's associated with your side, and the ILS that's associated with your side. And so in the case of the captain, that's going to be the left VOR, the left ADF, and the left ILS. In the case of the first officer, it's going to be the right VOR, the right ADF, and the right ILS. And in the case of the center CDU, it would be the center ILS. And these may be in there automatically. Like if this was put in prior to the failure, then it would be put in there automatically. It would remember it. But if the ILS was not put in there, then you'd have to manually tune this frequency. There's no auto tuning anymore, remember, so you'd have to put 110.8/037 and line selected into the ILS line. Or any VOR that you want is going to have to be manually tuned. And of course, ADFs are manually tuned anyway, so that no change there. They have to be manually tuned anyway. But the VORs were automatically tuned and the ILS is automatically tuned. Well, that's not available anymore when both FMCs have failed. You can still use the pre-select line, nothing wrong with that. And then, of course, one thing we're going to have to do when we come in for the approach is we're going to have to know what our gross weight is in order to get our VREF speed, in order to figure out our flap speeds for landing, because that nice information is gone now. Remember, the perf init page is gone, right? So if the perf init page is gone, you're going to know what your zero fuel weight is, because that's a fixed number. And then you're going to have your fuel on board, and so you're going to add that zero fuel weight to your fuel to come up with this number of, let's say, 650. And then come up with that VREF 30 speed 149. And then on most QRHs, they used to have this table. Something tells me they've taken this out, and I'm not sure why. Because if you have a dual FMC problem, you need to know this. It's not that hard, actually, to remember. The up bug is plus 80, VREF 30 plus 80, and then you go down 20 knots for each one. So VREF plus 80 is the up bug, plus 60 is flaps 1, plus 40 is flaps 5, plus 20 is flaps 10, and then you go down 10 knots. Flap 20 is plus 10, and then you got your VREF 25 or VREF 30 speed if we land with flap 30 or 25. So it's kind of easy here to remember this, but there is a chart generally in the performance section for the flap maneuver speeds. So we could take that 149 and then add 80 to it, and that would be 229. And then go down 10 knots, 209, and then go down another 20 knots and get to, you'd go like that. And you'd come up with a chart, basically, that has your flap up speed, flap 1, flap 5, flap 10, flap 20, and flap 30 speeds. And so you could reference those, because these speeds are no longer going to be on your PFD because you have no approach reference page to get that. So we have to figure these out manually, so we'll do that. So if you do lose both FMCs, you're going to get the autopilot degraded message, and that means that the airplane's been put in an attitude stabilizing mode. We're going to look at that, and we're going to say, okay, there's a degradation in roll mode, there's a degradation in pitch mode, I need to go to heading select, I need to go to flight level change. Or I need to go to heading select, and it's an altitude hold, so we're good. If there was no FMA degradation, if you looked up there and you saw nothing, there's no FMA change, well, chances are in that case it could be that the autopilot is degraded. And so what are we going to do? We can disconnect the autopilot and re-engage another autopilot and see if we get it again. And chances are it could be just an autopilot problem, and we might have two other good autopilots. If we were to get it again, I might suspect that it could be maybe something like a stab trim problem. When I disconnect it, I'll be feeling if there's forward pressure or aft pressure that I'm holding or no pressure. And it could be that there's maybe a stabilizer problem, whether it's the stabilizer's been cut out and we get a message for that. Or maybe we're going to get an unscheduled stab trim. But either way, I'm going to disconnect the autopilot. If there's no FMA change, I'm going to disconnect the autopilot and try a different autopilot. So again, the CDUs will retain the flight plan waypoints in the CDU, because like we said, they are a little microprocessor. They're a little computer that remembers. And so they'll remember up to 120 waypoints in the flight plan. And so it retains those waypoints at the time of the failure of both FMCs. Any new waypoints have to be entered by latitude, longitude. Any old waypoints, we can call it by its name. And because it remembers that lat long is for that name. But any new waypoints, we have to enter the lat long to go direct to them. The retained waypoints are modified as normal, but each side is independent. What that means is the left CDU is different from the right CDU, is different from the center CDU. So the retained waypoints can be modified as normal, but when you execute, it's only going to show up on one side. So if you go direct to ABC and ABC is part of your route, then that's fine. But it's just going to show up on the left side, let's say, if you were to put that in. So the first officer would have to put that in as well. And they could be off a little bit because one's getting left IRS information, the other's getting right IRS information. So, but you could, split the difference. And again, you'd have no LNAV, so you'd have to fly in heading select. Again, what's inoperative? LNAV, VNAV, and the auto throttle are inoperative. So the route can be flown in heading select and flight level change for the descent, for example. It would be fine, or any other pitch mode or roll mode. Interestingly, Land 3 and Land 2, the auto land's still operational. There's nothing wrong with the auto land. We can still do an auto land just fine. It's just that there's no auto throttle, so you're going to be the auto throttle. The pilot's the auto throttle. So the pilot flying would fly the airplane, monitor airspeed and airspeed control because that's manual thrust. Again, we have to figure out the maneuver speeds for landing. We can do that because we know the zero fuel weight. We do have the fuel on board. We can add those together to come up with a gross weight, and then we can go to the chart in the QRH to get the flap maneuver speeds. Again, many people know these speeds as plus 80, plus 60, plus 40, plus 20, plus 10, and then VREF 30. So it's not something that you're probably you could know this anyway as one of the pilots of these airplanes. And then you must tune the nav aids manually. So the nav aids have to be tuned manually. What was tuned previous to the failure would still be tuned. So that's a good thing, but if there's something new you want to tune, you have to tune it manually. What's this say? All this is saying is that with the master FMC failed, there is no auto throttle. Descending in a pitch mode other than VNAV with no auto throttle, the pilot flying is not always attentive to his decreasing airspeed until the airspeed low ICAS message displays, and then he may be slow in adding thrust. Without a control column for pitch input, the airplane can quickly develop into a PIO, pilot-induced oscillation, resulting in development of unrecoverable phugoid pitch tendencies and a resulting crash. Well, that hit. So what they're saying here is that in the FTD, because you can't really control it, as FMC failures happen, and even dual FMC failures still sometimes occur, demonstrating them is an important training point. A lot of times when you get dual FMC failures, those FMCs can be restored by pulling the circuit breakers and resetting them. And that's usually what maintenance is going to have you do. I don't know how often it's happening now, but it used to happen quite a bit in the past. And they would reset by pulling the circuit breaker and then pushing the circuit breaker back in. And a lot of times they would reset at that point. So it says demonstrating them is an important training point. For this reason, listed above, the FMC failure is best left for FFS less than 10, 10T, and or 6S. If it's a short course, it's 6 periods. If it's a longer course, it's 10 periods. So all this is saying that it was moved from lesson 6 to lesson 10, I believe. And that's why, because they wanted you to do this in the full flight and not in the FTD. Okay, so on the way into Spokane, first we'll have the single. We'll talk about that. We'll do it. We'll go through the checklist. Once that's complete, then we'll have the dual. And then that will result in an ILS approach to an auto land into Spokane. And then we'll taxi clear the runway, do our shutdown and securing. That's the time when you go on to the full flight. After you've completed the full flight, you're type rated, and then you go to the Dash 8 differences. So this is usually the last lesson before you go on to full flight. Okay, that completes Ftd-Pc Fs number 10 brief. Yeah, that's what I just said.